With the frequent biblical injunctions that we should be mindful of the poor, provision for those most in need has often fallen to the church. The Elizabethan Poor Law codified some of this, and it was also in the Elizabethan era that there is the first record in the town books of a poor box being established at St Nicholas's. The churchwardens were often the overseers of the poor as well, though this doubling of tasks was not easy. In July 1666, it was decided that the churchwardens of the preceding year should be appointed as overseers of the poor, and for those unwilling to fulfil the role, there would be a fine of £5. The church often found itself in control of legacies and other funds for the poor as well. For example, when Anne Molyneux died in 1729, she left £300 for the relief of sailors and their widows, and £200 for the relief of poor prisoners. Today, I am a trustee of the Molyneux and Warbrick charity, which administers that legacy along with other funds, and has always had both the Rector of Liverpool and the Lord Mayor of Liverpool on its board of trustees. As an aside, Anne Molyneux also left to the church in her will this rather large communion flagon. Until the mid-18th century, the vestry made provision for the poor in what became known as outdoor relief. That is, providing charitable grants for the poor to remain living on their own and outside an institution. The extensive vestry minutes for Liverpool reveal some interesting details. For example, in 1723, the overseers rented from Brian Blundell, a slave trader who'd also founded the Bluecoat School with the rector some years earlier, 36 new houses. The idea was to move poor families into these and out of private rented accommodation. Those who refused to move to the new houses would be struck from the roll of the poor. But in 1736, Lawrence and Sarah Robinson petitioned the parish for relief. They found themselves in arrears, and although they felt able to meet the rent, they could not clear the debt. The vestry readily agreed to pay the arrears on their behalf, presumably because the alternative was more expensive if they became dependent on the parish for poor relief. The building of the first workhouse in Liverpool was a joint venture between the council and the vestry, begun in 1732. It was built on the corner of College Lane and Hanover Street, and the governance and oversight of the institution became a significant preoccupation of the vestry. In the 1750s, they began to look at an extension, and then in 1769, plans were drawn up for a new workhouse on Brownlow Hill, seen in this photograph from the early 20th century. It stood roughly where the Metropolitan Cathedral was later built. Happily for the parish, though not necessarily for those who were confined to the institution, the workhouse was also a source of income, as the residents were put to work in return for their board, lodging and health care. This was no panacea, despite the optimistic report found in Smith's Stranger's Guide to Liverpool, published in 1843, which said, "The interior accommodation is good. Aged persons inhabiting apartments on the ground floor. Each individual is employed in some trade, the male adults as joiners, tailors, shoemakers, bricklayers, slaters, blacksmiths, spinners, etc., and the females as seamstresses, bonnet makers, etc. Boys are instructed in various trades to fit them for becoming apprentices. The establishment is supported by the poor rates and is under the control of the parish authorities." In fact, the conditions were overcrowded, and this was not an easy place to be, as we can see from these 19th century bathing regulations, which show scant regard for dignity and respect for the residents. They do, though, strictly prohibit two persons occupying a bath at the same time, but more of that in a moment. During the century or so that the vestry ran the workhouse, there was a steady move towards professionalisation. Churchwardens, overseers and guardians of the poor were gentlemen who gave their time freely. Superintendents and matrons in the workhouse were salaried, and increasingly all the functions needed to be professionalised. In our archives are these printed minutes of a vestry meeting in 1805, when it was decided to divide the town into districts for the poor, and appoint a committee to each district to visit the poor who were still receiving outdoor relief. Not everyone went to the workhouse. And this is the letter sent to each of those nominated to serve on the committee to ask if they'd be willing to do it, the implication being that they were not at the meeting to agree in person. The paperwork generated by the workhouse was considerable, and the continued professionalisation was inevitable and possibly desirable. Whether the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act was able to exercise the same compassionate benevolence towards the poor is another matter, but it was this act, reinforced by the Select Vestry Act of 1842, which effectively removed responsibility for the poor and the workhouse away from the parish, although the churchwardens continued to serve the new Poor Law Union until the 20th century, and the Rector of Liverpool was the chairman. Things were not always well, though. An article in a national periodical, The Satirist, in 1843 described the Liverpool workhouse as the largest brothel in Europe. There was an immediate investigation chaired by one of the churchwardens looking into both sexual immorality within the workhouse and also some other allegations, such as that an inmate had been refused a Bible and that other inmates had not been permitted to attend church. The birth of 3 illegitimate children to long-standing residents within the previous year clearly indicated that more than a prohibition on 2 people in the bath was required if the place was to maintain proper Victorian standards of repression. The licence held in our archives for a new chapel at the workhouse in 1855 kept control of religion firmly within the parish, although delegated to a workhouse chaplain. Although later in the century there was also a Catholic chaplain, the parish of Liverpool maintained its institutional grip over both the Committee of the Poor Law Union in Liverpool and also religious observance in the workhouse. The workhouse finally closed in 1928.